Hello, students of history, and welcome to History Rocks. Today we're going to take a look at Jewish resistance and defiance to the Nazi Holocaust. Now, of course, there are a lot of resistance movements during World War II. However, this is just a quick video to take a look at the kinds of choices that Jews had to make in their resistance to the Holocaust, and some of the groups that made the choice to fight rather than to wait for their fate that the Nazis had in store for them. So we'll start out by asking some questions here about, how hard would it be to defy the Nazi regimes? I mean, the Nazi regime that's going to take over, of course, not only Germany, but also much of the rest of Europe, is going to have a system in place that makes it very difficult to resist, especially when you are seen as racially unfit and don't quite fit in with the rest of society. So some questions to consider as we look at this is, what are the various ways in which conquered peoples could respond to the Nazis? Well, first of all, you could collaborate. Now, another thing to consider, though, too, is if you were Jewish at this time under the Nazi system of the Holocaust, what choices did you have available to you? Now, you might say, of course, that there's no choices because they are the ones that are being subjected to this tyranny from the Nazis, but I would make the argument that no matter where you are in life, no matter what you're doing, you always have a choice. No matter how terrible the circumstances, you always have choices in front of you. Of course, those choices could be terrible. They could end in death. They could end in the destruction of your life and your family's lives and your townspeople's lives, you name it. It could end terribly, but you always have a choice. So we're going to take a look first at exactly what collaborationists are. All right, so collaboration simply means that you are complicit with the regime that is in power, in this case, the Nazis. So if the Nazis come into your country, you either actively participate in this regime or you show complicity, meaning that you do nothing to stop it. Of course, that is difficult to do to stop it, but at the same time, there are those that will actively participate, maybe because they agree with the ideology of the Nazis. You also provide workers and resources for the Nazis. The Nazis are going to be famous for not only, of course, the Holocaust, but the fact that they are going to enslave tens of millions of people from around Europe in the conquered territories that they take. What they'll do is they'll end up taking people from all over Europe that are able-bodied males especially and put them into work groups that wear gray uniforms and are brought all over Hitler's empire to build all of the various things that Hitler wants to build for the Third Reich. And part of the reason that Hitler had so many excellent military defenses to defend for so long against the Allied onslaught against Europe is because Hitler was stealing resources and stealing people from their countries. The country in Europe that provided the least amount of workers and fought against the Nazis the most on this policy was Greece. All right, Greece is going to end up having probably one of the worst times during the Holocaust and the Nazi occupation per capita. Now, another thing that can happen under a collaborationist regime is that you actively try to carry out the ideology of the Nazis. All right, so the ideology might be appealing to the point where people actually want to do this, or because they think that they'll be safer by not resisting. And of course they will be, because the Nazis have this system called reprisal. Reprisal means that any time there is an act of violence perpetrated against the Nazis or one of their soldiers, they will kill 10 civilians for every one German soldier that is killed or wounded. They will also kill 100 civilians for every one officer that is killed or wounded by partisan or resistance fighters. All right, good examples of that. There are towns all over Europe that will experience this, but there's some towns in Czechoslovakia, for instance, where there were enough resistance fighters that fought against the Nazis that they massacred the entire town in order to send a message to the surrounding area that you don't mess with the Nazis. But within Germany, there are many Germans themselves that do not support the Nazis and will take a strong stance against this policy. Now, one of those most famous groups is the White Rose, and the fact that these are three young individuals. They're college students. They are a student movement that is going to begin at the University of Munich, and it's led by Hans Scholl, his sister Sophie Scholl, and Christopher Probst. Now, they're going to do everything they can to spread their information covertly, first at the University of Munich and then all over Germany through what they called the White Rose Letters. They're going to try and spread this information to young people like themselves, knowing that older Germans who are maybe married or have children are going to be more fearful and less likely to rebel because they fear reprisal against their family members. However, these young people are going to start this movement, and they're going to spread secret messages that say things like, "We will not be silent. We are your bad conscience. The White Rose will not leave you in peace." Well, of course, the Germans are going to be looking for these people like crazy. The Gestapo is going to be hunting them down as much as possible at the University of Munich. Finally, the janitor at the school is going to end up turning these three in, and they will be executed publicly on February the 18th. Now, Sophie is going to go before the tribunal presented by the Nazis here that are going to try them for treason, and she's going to give a stirring condemnation of the Nazi Party and a stirring condemnation of Germans who sit idly by while these crimes are being perpetrated. And they will all actually end up being guillotined, but not before they have a chance to stand once again against the Nazis, uttering their dying words, "Long live freedom," and stand in defiance of all despotism. Now, another thing that we have at this time, if you're a big fan of the movie Inglourious Basterds by Quentin Tarantino, fabulous film, right? And totally fake, you might be thinking. Well, that's kind of true because it's obviously very Hollywoodized, very fake, but at the same time, it's based upon a story about Jewish partisan fighters. They're called the Jewish Brigade. And the Jewish Brigade were a bunch of Palestinian Jews who had left Europe. Either their families had left Europe before the war, or they had left just before or during the war and made it to Palestine, and Israel does not exist yet, right? So they're living there in British occupied territory, and they specifically requested to the Allied government, especially Great Britain, if they could be trained as fighters to be able to jump behind enemy lines, paratroop in, and then wreak havoc on the Germans and try to not only rescue their own townspeople, but maybe even start resistance movements of their own in their former hometowns where their families were from. Well, one of the most famous examples of this happens to be a young woman by the name of Hanna Szasnaz. She was 23 years old, she was Hungarian, and in 1943, she requested that she be allowed to parachute into her hometown in Hungary. And she even told her fellow Jews in her hometown that, and this is happening just days before they're about to be deported to Auschwitz and to their deaths. She says, even if our chances for success are minuscule, we must go. She is going to end up getting caught for her activities. She's going to be convicted and tried as a traitor by a collaborationist regime within Hungary who are collaborating with the Nazis. And then as she is about to be executed, she's able to smuggle a letter out to her hometown, to the Jews that were in the ghetto there. And she said, "Continue on the way. Don't be deterred. Continue the struggle to the end until the day of liberty comes, the day of victory for our people." Beautiful. That, again, sticking it to the Nazis. All right, now just a quick little some facts about ghettos at this time. Ghettos, of course, were a place where the Nazis would start to house as many Jews as possible and relocate them from their hometowns or their homes themselves and put them in ghettos as a temporary staging ground before they are brought to Auschwitz or Treblinka or Kemlo or another death camp of that sort. Now, many Jewish elders at this time, the religious leaders, the parents, those kinds of people, they usually decided that it was better and safer not to resist. They felt they had more to lose because, of course, the Nazi policy of reprisal would kill their families, but they also felt that maybe things would not be that bad, that the Nazis could not possibly do the terrible things that rumors had been saying they were doing. But of course, the truth will become more and more exposed, and this will lead to ghetto uprisings, and primarily amongst the youth. All right, the youthful members of the Jewish society that have been interned at this point are far more likely to rebel because they feel they have less to lose and more to gain by fighting. So the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising is going to be the largest ghetto uprising in the history of the Holocaust. Now, the Warsaw Ghetto was only 1.3 miles in size, and it was supposed to house over 400,000 Jews, and at any given moment, you could have 7 or 8 people living in each room in that 1.3 miles of space. There's very little clean water, clean food, you name it. It's terrible living conditions, of course. So by September of 1942, though, over 300,000 Jews had been deported, or liquidated, as the Nazis called it, leaving very few left. Around 60,000 people that were left that had not either died or been liquidated and removed to a camp like Auschwitz. And many of these people happened to be youthful folks that were left around to work. And they formed up the ZOB, as it was called, or the Żydowska Organizacja Bojowa, I think is how you say it in Polish. In January of 1942, Heinrich Himmler ordered that another 8,000 people be deported to Treblinka. And this is going to spark some small uprisings that the Germans will quickly subdue. However, by April of 1943, the Jews chose on Passover itself to start this uprising. And they sent out a message as a signal that the resistance would begin, saying, "All are ready to die as human beings." And this led to 4 weeks of street fighting. Now, the Germans sent in 2,000 men supported by tanks and flamethrowers, and as they moved in, they suspected this would only take a couple of days at most to put this down. But again, it took 4 full weeks. The action as it's taking place, they're going to get shot to pieces, of course. By April the 20th, the street fighting became hand-to-hand combat, and the Germans at one point are going to ask for a 15-minute truce. Now, what this is going to lead to, of course, is a very sad scene in which the survivors that are left after the Germans went door to door with flamethrowers and grenades, blowing up or burning anything that moved. Once the Jews are out of ammunition, out of places to hide, they are brought before this wall in Warsaw. And the wall, part of the wall is still left there today as a memorial. They call it the Second Wailing Wall as a reference to the temple in Jerusalem. And this is where the Germans shot all of the survivors down. Now, another example of a famous ghetto uprising is the Vilna Ghetto in Lithuania. The Germans invaded into Lithuania in 1941, and within 6 months, so many Jews had been deported and sent to camps, concentration camps, death camps, you name it, and put into ghettos like Vilna that many of the youth especially had had enough, and they had heard the rumors about what was going on and chose to believe them. So on January the 1st, 1942, only 6 months after the German invasion, they sent out this call to arms to the other Jews of the area. They said, "Jewish youth, do not believe those that are trying to deceive you. Out of 80,000 Jews in the Jerusalem of Lithuania, which is Vilna, only 20,000 are left. Before our eyes they took away our parents, our brothers and sisters. Where are the hundreds of men who were conscripted for labor? Where are the naked women and the children who were taken away from us on that dreadful night? Where are the Jews who were deported on Yom Kippur? And where are our own brethren in the second ghetto? Of those taken through the gates of the ghetto, not a single one has returned. All the Gestapo roads lead to Ponar, which is the forest 7 miles outside the city, and Ponar means death. Ponar is not a concentration camp. They have all been shot there. Hitler plans to destroy all the Jews of Europe, and the Jews of Lithuania have been chosen as the first in line. We will not be led like sheep to the slaughter. True, we are weak and helpless, but the only response to the murderer is revolt. Brothers, it is better to die fighting like free men than to live at the mercy of the murderers. Arise, arise with your last breath." You know, it's people like this that find that resistance is its own reward. Even at times when the odds seem impossible to overcome, they realize that resistance is its own reward. Another famous example of resistance to the Nazis will take place in the area known as Belarus, which is part of Russia at this time, the Soviet Union. But the Nazis are going to invade in June of 1941 with Operation Barbarossa. And at that point, many that were either trained fighters with the Red Army, that the Red Army was surrendering left and right, and so many of these members of the military escaped and tried to form their own groups of what are called partisan fighters, which are little makeshift armies that they just use any kinds of guerrilla warfare methods possible to kill as many Nazis as they can. But another prominent example of that happened to be Jewish partisans, because Jewish partisans had even more reason to fight, because the Nazis were fighting in Russia with a thing that they called their Vernichtungskrieg, which means their war of annihilation against the racially unfit. Of course, the Jews fit that mold for them of racially unfit, but as did many other Russians as well, who were Slavic and therefore, according to the Nazis, lesser. So what these Jewish partisans did is they formed mobile fighting brigades in the forest of the USSR, and one of the most famous brigades is known as the Bielski brothers. They were just a few brothers who had witnessed their family being murdered by a death squad in December of 1941. 4 brothers were left, and these brothers fled to the woods, and they took with them 13 others. Tuvia Bielski was the eldest brother, and he sent a message to the Jewish ghetto where they had formerly lived, and he said, "Organize as many friends and acquaintances as possible. Send them to me in the woods. I will wait for you." First 8 people came. Then over 1,200 people came over the next 2 years. They formed a mobile town in which they went from various parts of the forest to another part. They worked to build cabins and houses. They established a school. They lived like outlaws, trying to attack the Nazis when they could, escape them when they couldn't, and then fight for their freedom. And why this is so important is, again, so many of these people that fought at this time and resisted, they just faced death. They ended their lives fighting. But the fact is that, again, resistance is its own reward for many of those people. But the key here to remember is that while we often, with our studies of the Holocaust, focus on the death camps and the ghettos, and rightfully so, it's important also to look at not the helplessness of those people that became victims, but also to those whose memory needs to preserve for the way that they fought, for the way that they responded to the Nazi onslaught by not giving up. Because as Elie Wiesel, an inmate, a child inmate at Auschwitz, once said, "To forget the dead would be akin to killing them a second time." Thanks for watching.